I think it's fair to say anyone who's ever picked up an instrument and tried to learn to play it, at some point, hopefully, they've aspired to be a good musician. But I think in order to achieve anything, you first have to define it. Specificity is quite important. So let me ask you, Chris, what does it mean to you to be a good musician?
Have you disclosed what you think is a good musician?
What would I think is a good musician?
Yeah. Go on.
Turn the light on me.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll go for it. For me, there are kind of being a good musician is a tripod of three key elements.
Okay.
And what I tend to find is people focus a little too much on one and assume that's the majority of it. But a tripod is supported by the three legs. If you kick one away, it falls. Mm-hmm. So for me, the bit that people focus all their energy on is the kind of expressing your inner world through music, and by doing so, moving your audience. Now, that's a very important leg of the tripod. But for me, that's supported by the other two legs. One is having a good technical facility on your instrument. Because if you don't have that, your ideas are always going to be limited by what you can and cannot do. So you have to have that as part of the mix. And the third one is a technical understanding of what you can do on the instrument. Understanding the kind of the theory that underpins a lot of things, essentially different ways you can approach the same problem and get an interesting solution. Because if you don't have that, your creativity will always be limited to a certain extent by your ignorance of how to get somewhere. You're blocking off different options you can choose from. So for me, those three are kind of the tripod, the triumvirate, if you will, that underpins a good musician. It's being able to play the instrument to a competent technical standard, so you're not limited. Understanding how things can work, so you know lots of different ideas that you can work with to solve one problem or try something that's a bit out of the box. And that helps come together if you have a creative disposition to help you communicate your inner world through music and hopefully move your audience. So for me, it's that triumvirate that makes a good musician. I might be wrong. What do you think?
No, I like that, man. I think at one point I would have said pretty much those things as well. But I guess I would now come from it from a slightly more almost, is anarchistic the right word? Kind of an extreme, maybe quite of an extreme viewpoint. I think this has been developed from approaching the instrument in a way that I've not been making music from a discipline or a musical culture that exists specifically. So I haven't necessarily been trying to achieve something. That might sound a little bit far out. I mean, I've obviously been trying to create things and make a career out of it as well. That's actually been a very conscious choice, but I've not been trying to sound like someone specific or what have you. I also find from my work in music education has shaped the sort of, again, more, I suppose, kind of seemingly extreme viewpoint of the musician thing. And that is that I think what I would agree with you 100% in, like, that's what makes a well-rounded musician, or a musician who is able to sit into a scenario of, I don't know, be able to perhaps improvise, to be able to compose something within an allotted time, to be able to do those things. However, I've found often the most incredible and wonderful things are coming from people who maybe don't possess those skills, or for me, when I've been creating and playing, it might be from actually not having those things as well. So working with instruments that I can't play, for example, is something that I've been dabbling in recently, or my work with guitar ensembles, where I've been working with players who might be complete beginners, where we're stripping things down to the absolute tiny sort of minimal ways of playing, because their technical abilities are limited and their understanding is limited. So I think in some ways there is a sort of a well-rounded musician, but there almost isn't a good musician. Do you know what I mean? There is just musicians. We're just making it. And actually, I think you could be the most. But this relates perfectly to the sort of the grading system, for example, of we can put students on a trajectory to get here, to be able to achieve this, and then they will be super well-rounded, and that's some great foundation. But actually, I think it's far more complex and abstract and crazy than that. I think actually sometimes people can create the most wonderful and amazing music from absolute lack of technical ability, but maybe they're coming from it from a perspective of something that's just completely different. And I know that probably doesn't resonate with people who maybe are just trying to pick up the guitar and achieve something at the end, and that's fine. There's nothing to take away from that. But I think, yeah, there is so much scope to be an incredible and amazing musician, but actually to lack some really fundamental things, bit theory, bit technical ability. You know, actually you can be brilliant. You can be brilliant without those things as well.
Well, you've raised a really good point there, because I'm wondering if maybe underpinning that question is a definition of two things, because ultimately, I suppose what we've not defined is the role of the craftsman and the role of the artist. Because those two are distinct identities, and you can be a fantastic craftsman and a mediocre artist, and you can be a fantastic artist and a mediocre craftsman. So I wonder if that's something that maybe needs to be thrown into the mix when considering a question like, what is a good musician?
Definitely. But I think so much musical learning, not just schools in any way, but just even however it is that we learn, it's quite often focused on that craftsmanship, isn't it? Again, rather than artistry. Partly because the idea of teaching artistry is kind of a little bit ridiculous in some ways, isn't it? Yes. It's like, here is how you will be a brilliant artist, so it's kind of like, well, that is kind of silly. But then, I think that then breaks down the idea of if you can teach that. I think you can actually teach that if you come from teaching from a perspective of where you're not filling empty vessels. That's that idea of actually, look, here's some ideas of inspiration that you can follow. I'm just facilitating you to find new and exciting things. I think if you teach from that perspective, you can then you can teach artistry and craftsmanship. But I guess most teaching and stuff comes from the idea of, I will give you the tools to be a craftsman.
That's interesting. I really enjoyed that element of our discussion. And by the way, no one's ever thrown it back at me and asked my opinion first. So that was, congratulations. You're the first one who's done that.
Good. Maybe if someone else does it in the future, say something completely different.
I will, yeah. I'll just completely contradict everything I've just said.
Yeah.